begin my experience. I sat this morning pondering exactly what I would say, and after about 5 or 10 minutes, I decided that I would just wing it. I will give you a brief history of my existence so that you may be able to have a clear path up until that fateful day, spring of 1970, when I first met the beast. I was a very precocious child back in the 60s. I had my own way of doing things. I understood the power in my individuality. Plus, I was cared for and nurtured by two parents who did not take my existence and shape it and form it and place it in a box. My father was a very progressive man. His train of thought was very unique. He was an artistic fellow. He was a musician as well as a painter and very philosophical. I found myself quite often as a child subject to his many parables. I have one living sibling, and I don't see her experiences as being parallel to mine. And I don't judge her for that. Anyway, my mother, very nurturing and loving. But oftentimes it felt as if she was checked out of the scenario and she was off somewhere distant in some far land. And I think she adapted that as a way to be able to cope with the things that she was burdened with. That's a whole nother story. So overall, my parents were very protective and allowed space for me to be nurtured in a way that enhanced my individuality. I remember when I was about 3 years of age, growing up in the housing projects of the city that I lived in the South. Now, this was back in the 60s, so the concept of housing projects was somewhat new. And my entry into this portal called life, I spent my first day up until the 14th year of my existence living in this one particular housing project unit with my mother, father, and my other sibling, which is a sister. I give that as a focal point so that you can understand the way that I was raised. I was not born with a silver spoon. I was not born with privilege of the boule. We just existed. Well, anyway, back to the scenario of when I was about 3. I remember my mother pulling up a chair in the bedroom window upstairs of the housing project unit that we lived in. And she opened the curtains that she had made herself. She was a seamstress as well as a tailor. And I remember these sheer panel, flowing, beautiful curtains that she had created. As she pushed them back, how the wind and the light just intermingled. And I just felt that it was just a beautiful existence. We grew up in the housing projects, but I never felt poor. There was always some sense of class and elegance about our home. Well, anyway, she opened those curtains and she asked me, what did I see? And it goes that I didn't answer. And she looked at me and she said, pick something. Tell me what you see, whether it be a tree, a car, an animal, or a person. And the story goes that I did so. And my mother looked at me lovingly. I can feel her gaze now, so warm. And she told me, she said, look, you are not what you see. You live here, but you do not live here. Your existence is not shaped and decided by anything that you see outside, no matter what it is. You have the ability to create your own reality and never allow the things around you or the people around you and their opinions to shape and create your reality. And this is a story that was told quite often when my family gathered together and they began to have merriment and partake of spirits and to eat of soul food. These stories would be shared. And so I grew up hearing this story. So as I began to grow, my personality began to shape. Although I was very capable of shaping and forming friendships, I did so in a very odd manner. And I say that because that is the label that was placed upon it as I began to mature. My sister was totally different than I was. She would often be found out within our neighborhood, bossing and controlling the masses. That was her thing. It is told often, and I do remember, that when she was 7, she had the ability to bully and control. Not bully in the sense that we know today, but to mandate what the other children did and did not do, the games that they played, the manner in which they maneuvered. She would be the orchestrator of that, and she would be known to be about the neighborhood with 4 or 5 or 6 different children who were sometimes quite older than herself at her command. Me, my friendships were shaped a little differently. They were unique and sparse, often sporadic. And so because of this, I spent a lot of time alone, a lot of time reading. I taught myself to read at an early age. So I became a lover of words. And during this development, I developed a sense that I equate to a sixth sense. At the time, my family would refer to it as my gut instinct. And I adapted a very close bond to this instinct. And throughout my years of development, this gut instinct would jump in and unction me to do or not do something. And as I began to develop and trust it, I would see the effects of me adhering to it. So because of this, I also realized that I was able to experience things in this gut before they would take place in the physical or 3D realm. And it was something that my parents was accustomed to experiencing with me as well. They delighted in it. They didn't discourage it. They didn't name it negatively. And as a matter of fact, my dad, I think he got off on it because it gave him a glimpse of his own reflection in something so innocent and so pure. And I believe that he delighted in it. My clairvoyance and my understanding of the basis of truths began to develop as well. And I have an incident when I was in first grade. I wasn't eager about going to school. I didn't want to be separated from the environment of my home and placed and thrust into an environment of multiples of people that I didn't personally know. So I verbally let my parents know that I was not pleased with having to go to school. But nonetheless, I was subject to it. And my mother felt that she wanted something different from my sister as far as education and what our peers were receiving, those that lived in the housing project, and that would be public school. So my mother decided that she would send us to private parochial school. And I went to parochial school from 1st to 7th grade. Well, anyway, that experience was a whole nother story that I would get into later. But when I was in 1st grade and I began to be tested, I started resulting in tests, something that alarmed my 1st grade teacher, not in a negative sense, but in a very curious manner. And I remember her pulling me to the side, and she said she had a question to ask me. And I was in agreement. Basically, she had been testing me and my scores were coming up perfect. And she was curious as to how I was able, especially when it came to true and false questions, how I was so systematic about having perfect scores. She didn't understand it. And I remember her sitting me down and she asked me, she said, I don't understand. She said, I've even switched the tests up on you. You know, give you a different test than I've given everybody else, and you always get 100%. She's like, how do you do that? She said, I've been trying to figure it out. And she said, I know you're not cheating. And I remember her asking me, how do you do that? And I remember responding to her. I looked at her as if to be bewildered as to why she would ask me that, because I thought everybody understood. And my response to her was, well, everybody knows that the truth, if you want to turn it into a lie, all you do is add to it. And I remember her chuckling. And she was like, I have to bring your parents in. And I remember she sent the note home and I took it to my parents. And my mom was saying, oh, we have to go to school. I don't know what this is about. And I know she's not in any type of trouble because she's not that type of a child. You know, she can be adamant and stubborn, but, you know, she's not unruly. And I remember my father was agitated because he didn't want to take the trip. He felt like it was a waste of his time. He wanted to do something else. And I remember the three of us walking up to that school that day because it was not that far. And we walked a lot back then. And we got to the school. And I remember the nun, she had her habit on. And she stood there. And she sat me down. And she said, now I'm going to ask you the same thing that I asked you alone in front of your parents. And I want you to tell them what you told me. And she did. And she asked, how are you able to have a perfect score every time? And she alerted my parents that she switched up the test. She gave me different tests than everybody else. And every time she gave me a test, when it came to being able to discern what was true and what was false, my score was perfect. And she asked me, and I told her the same thing that I told her when we were alone. I was like, well, everybody knows that in order to change the truth to a lie or make it false, you just add to it. And she slapped her knee, I'll never forget. And my father was exasperated. He was like, okay, is this what you brought me up here for? And my mother asked him to not do that. And my mother, of course, she looked at me and she, you know, gave me accolades and she encouraged me. And I took her hand and I walked toward the door and I alerted her I was ready to go home. So at that early age, along with the clairvoyance, the gut intuition, and the ability to just look at situations and discern great aspects of truth, the basis of truth, I was just onto something that was, now I'm learning, you know, to equate it to gifts. So that is my beginning. So let's go up to the day that I met the beast. I remember sitting in that classroom and I was peering outside, and I always wanted to just be, you know, under the sun or staring at the moon. You know, I seemed to have kinship with it all, and it was a time of, you know, sacred communal for me, because I didn't, you know, do as other children do, but that was something that I did a lot. And on this day, I just felt my gut being very vocal. And when I was sitting in that classroom, I was alerted that there was danger. And I remember my stomach getting nervous when I was a small child, and I would get these warnings that seemed to be more dangerous than others. I would become nervous in my stomach, and my stomach was rumbling, and I just wanted to get home. So as I began to leave the campus And, across the street, there was this trucking company where they house the cabs to semi, freight. And so these cabs would be lined up and they would have the attachments with the slant that kind of looked like the shape of a horseshoe. And they would have these tubes of petroleum oil. It was a reddish oil that they would squirt on these things. I remember that, and I remember the scent of it. And I remember just walking along the fence and that sidewalk, and I was just thinking about how long the sidewalk was. And something told me, when you turn this corner, there's danger. So as I turned the corner, I saw this turquoise, bluish car. And back in those days, in the 60s and early 70s, cars were pretty tough. They were big. They had these sharp, angled edges. And so I could see the wing and shape of the back of this car that was parked. And it was parked on the side of the sidewalk of this trucking company. And I remember that there were certain days that this, grounds of this trucking company wouldn't have any workers there. And this was that day. So as I began to turn the corner and walk, my gut informed me that this car was very dangerous, and the person in this car was even more dangerous. My first instinct was to pivot and turn and make a perimeter around the corner across the street. But then the gut said, no, that's too dangerous. Don't do that. And then also I was quick to change my mind, because on the opposite side of the street was a funeral home. And often that funeral home haunted me with the ideas of what was going on inside. So I found it more easier for me to just stay on this side and just to follow my gut. And I sensed that I was to keep up my gait the way that I normally do. And as soon as I was alerted, to pivot and go another direction. I was a moderately fast little girl, so to my brain and the way that I moved and maneuvered and I ran, it seemed like easy peasy for me. So I remembered, as I began to walk and I got closer to the car, I could see through the back of the window, and I could see the head, the form and shape of this male who was sitting in this car. It was a round, bald head, and it was that of a Caucasian man who was balding at the top with thin gray layer of hair around the edges. And as I got to the car, he began to move, and my heart began to race, and the danger seemed more imminent than before. And just when I got to the back of his car enough that I could reach my hand out and touch it, something told me, pivot now and run around and cross the street, and don't stop running until you get home. So just as that gut instinct relayed that to me, this man jumped out of the car with his pants open and his genitals exposed, his erect penis veiny and very, very grotesque. It alarmed me. And he went to grab me. And just when he went to grab me, I pivoted and I ran. Based on his reaction, he was surprised by that. And because of that, he lost his footing. And because he was thrown off, I believe, he slipped and tripped because he was not prepared for me to be that stealthy. And he fell. And I remember I took off running, and I was screaming and I was hollering, and I ran and my heart was beating faster. And there was a byway. I could see it. It was a street that I crossed all the time. And in my brain, I'm like, I normally stop, because it was 2 lanes going one way and 2 lanes going the opposite direction. And this intersection was always difficult for me because it just seemed so intense. and I just never wanted to be hit by a car. So when I got to that intersection, I just prayed and I kept saying, please don't let me get hit. Please don't let me get hit. And I could see to my left the oncoming traffic, but I didn't have time to look to my right because I was in full force, full speed, and I just ran and I just booked it through the intersection. And when I got to the other side, I realized that I wasn't hit, and I turned around and I could see him gathering himself and getting in his vehicle. And I just began to scream and I began to run and I began to zigzag. I don't know, something just told me don't run a straight line. And next thing I knew, I was to a place where my gut says, you're okay. And I don't know what it was about the surroundings, but I felt like I was safe. And when I turned around, he wasn't there. I remember when I got home and I shared it with my parents. I don't even really know what their response was. I think that after that incident, I really just kind of checked out as a result of the trauma. But I do remember this, something that I noticed before but didn't ever really notice. Like I say, this was 1970, and we would get our milk cartons, the half gallon and the quarts. And on the side of these quarts and half gallons, there was these images of missing children. And after that incident, I took greater notice of these images. And I remember, like it was yesterday, that when I looked at these images, it reminded me of how fortunate I was that those images were not one of me. So that is my experience. I will say this. When I looked into this beast's eyes, it was something that I could never forget. You know, I often hear people talk about the experiencing of smelling death. That is a smell that you will never forget, that you can smell even when it's not there at times. That's how that look is. That gaze, that ominous stare. It's a look and a gaze that is open, that when you peer into it, it's like an endless abyss, and you never forget. So after that incident, as I began to mature up until today, I have seen that gaze. I have seen that gaze in many. I have seen it in neighbors. I have seen it in clergymen. I have seen it in peers. I have even seen it in my own relatives. And because of this experience, when I was 7 years of age, it led me to not forget and to also understand that this beast was not just going to go away. And I have to say that now, some 48 years later, this beast has definitely evolved. And that evolutionary process has been a very, very peculiar one. Once that beast, always brazen, open in the public. After that particular incident, and the word began to spread about its existence, you know, and I told my parents, and my parents told their friends, and it became common knowledge in the neighborhood. It seemed as if the beast took a hiatus. I looked for it throughout my daily goings, and I didn't see it. It seemed to be tucked away for some years, but it eventually showed itself again. And it showed itself in a relative. And that is another story that I will share in future episodes. I hope that this share was something that you found interesting, if not helpful. Stay tuned. The beast that devours the young.